Hi, folks. Welcome to another episode of From Pen to Page. And today is very special because I'm going to be interviewed about my new book coming out very soon, probably within the next month or so. Manitou, a supernatural crime thriller. Now, my wife has told me often that I am not a great interviewee. I tend to jump over facts and stuff. So she insisted that she actually interview me, and she does a very good job of doing that. I think she's interviewed other people for her business and her YouTube channel. So today we're going to go off script and change the format a little bit, and she's going to ask me the questions that she thinks that you might want to know about my new book. Hi, Kelly.
Glenn. You never call me Kelly. That's
I know,
weird.
it's not weird.
That
It's
is weird. This is Puffin, by the way. If you haven't met him yet, hopefully he will be quiet
We
for
hope.
this interview, but we'll see because, he has a mind of his own.
Yes.
So I'm really excited to do this interview with you because I think that, one of the things that we are all, and I include myself in this, typically so bad at is self-promotion.
Yes.
And as much as we, on the one hand, love talking about ourselves, we also hate talking about ourselves.
Yes.
And I think, especially in the way that we're trying to get somebody interested about something that we put out there or, buy our book or whatever, we suck at it. We suck at it. And I think this is hopefully going to be a great way for your audience to really get to know not only this book, which I've read and it's awesome, but also you as a writer in general, as a whole. And so I'm really excited. I've got some questions. I will be reading them because I didn't memorize them.
Well, thank you for doing it. Yeah, you're right. I personally hate promoting myself. I don't really know how to do it very well. Like I've sort of been learning, and you know this, I've been learning kind of over the last couple of years how to kind of what's involved when you indie publish a book as far as marketing and promotion goes. And I'm still learning a lot. But this aspect of it, I'm especially terrible at because I just feel awkward in my own skin, which is kind of the imposter syndrome I think every writer feels. So, but anyway, thank you for making me do this. And yeah, ask away.
All right. So we're going to start with a really, really simple, straightforward question. For someone who hasn't yet heard of this book, which we haven't actually named yet, Manitou.
Manitou. I know, I mentioned it in the opening.
Did you?
I don't know.
I don't know. I feel like you said this next book. I don't know if we actually. Anyway, it's called Manitou.
Yep.
How would you describe the story without giving too much away?
Okay, I'm going to just I can give you like the elevator pitch, and then I will give you kind of the opening, and then hopefully that'll, pique your interest as a reader. The elevator pitch is it's Jaws meets Breaking Bad in the woods, which sounds weird, but it isn't once you start reading it. The longer version of that is it's a story about Roy Farmer, a forest ranger that works in the North Idaho wilderness manning a fire tower. Yeah, those still exist. And he is going through a crisis moment in his life. And he is an alcoholic. And he is on the verge of killing himself until one night during a summer storm, he witnesses a cartel plane crashing in the woods nearby. And he is forced out of his stupor to investigate, and what he finds are a whole stash of drugs laying around and the severed limb of the pilot. As he continues to investigate, he unravels kind of a web of corruption in a nearby mountain town. And as he continues to investigate, the stakes sort of rise because people are being murdered horribly. And what he soon realizes is that the thing that is somehow attached to this cartel plane, somehow attached to these drugs, this thing that is killing people isn't human. And that is kind of the opening of Manitou.
So this is maybe a little bit of a departure. Things that you've written in the past.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, going back to even like the screenplays you wrote when you were younger and all of those things, which, many of which have never seen the light of day, but I've gotten the chance to read them.
You've read a few.
Is it still pretty different.
Yeah.
From all of that. So I'm curious to know, like, what was it that first sparked the idea for this book, and what made it something that you just had to write?
So I have this philosophy about story ideas, and it's that if it lives rent free in your head for like more than a few months, if it just keeps coming back to you and growing, that at some point you need to put it to paper, from pen to page, right? You need to exercise it from your brain. And you know, me writing this was kind of a way to say, look, this thing's been living in my head for, I don't know, at least 10 years. And I wanted to finally write it down. And I wasn't really sure where I was going with it originally, but it sort of grew and expanded. And, people ask, are you an architect writer or a pantser? And I'm kind of a mixture of both. I have.
Can you explain that a little bit? Because for
Sure. Yeah.
non-authors, we don't know.
So as a writer, we often think, that the author suddenly just creates a book from nothing, but that's not really how it works. And there's like different ways that authors create a story. One is they're called architects, where you basically outline your story idea from beginning to end, all the way, every scene, every chapter, every character, everything ahead of time before you ever write a word. And that's kind of like the architect type. And then there's the pantsers, where you're writing by the seat of your pants.
No.
And
I thought you were saying some newfangled French word.
No, no.
Like connoisseur? What is
Pastor,
that supposed to mean?
pastor. No.
Okay.
It's you're writing by the seat of your pants. You tend to have an idea of the characters and maybe just kind of a broad idea of what the plot might be, but you kind of let the story organically unfold as you write it. So those are kind of two different methods that a lot of writers use. And then there's a third type, which is kind of a hybrid of both.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I feel like when you talk about those two types, my first thought always goes to J.K. Rowling, simply because she wrote such a huge world. There's no way. I guess there's no way is kind of maybe not fair to say, but I feel like there's no way she knew everything she was gonna do from the beginning. It's just way too immense. But we also know that that very last scene, that future
The last
forward
book,
scene,
yeah.
but not even just the last book, like literally the last scene in the book, she wrote at the beginning. She knew who was gonna end up with who, and who was still gonna be alive, and all that sort of thing. So it sort of feels like she kind of did a little bit of a combination. Is that she knew where she ultimately wanted to go, but as far as how she was gonna get there, clearly she just let it go.
And I feel like I'm a little similar, not that I write about magic schools or anything, but just, her method, that's kind of similar to how I do it. Is I had very specific visual scenes in my mind. I had the ending in my mind really early on. I had one or two other ideas about the plot. I was really interested in the plot. I didn't really know the characters that well until I started writing it. And there are some people that say, oh, well, you should really know your characters, and you should. Ideally, you really have a strong grip of your characters, but for me in this story, I was stronger with the plot than I was the characters, and then as I revised, the characters sort of deepened, and I sort of learned more about who they are. So that's kind of the process that I went through, and then the inspiration was really the first inspiration I had is I was working as a college and camp counselor. You remember when we were dating? I worked for an organization called Pathways in Education, and part of their deal was to take at-risk teenagers to these camps in California. And, it was like a weekender thing, and they learned team building skills, and they kind of, these are usually teenagers that kind of come from a rougher background, or, are struggling academically or personally. So, they're kind of going to alternative high schools and stuff. But we take them, and we would take them up on these mountains and these camps, and they would learn how to communicate and team building and all these things that kind of help them, learn better communication skills and stuff. And I remember clearly that there was this one afternoon night where we're hiking as this entire group, and of course I'm in the back because I'm out of shape and you know sound like a dying llama or something while I'm hiking up this trail with all these teenagers and these other chaperones and counselors and stuff. And we walked past a series of concentric stones on the ground. And I remember our guide saying that, this was at one time like Native American ground. And these stones we don't touch because it was something spiritual and symbolic to whatever tribe. I don't even know the name of the tribe, but it was like their spirit stones and whatever. And I remember like sort of staying behind as the group went forward and just looking at these large, and it was large rings. It wasn't just a few inches across. The diameter was really quite wide, and it sort of reminded me of Pet Cemetery. You know what I mean? Like, don't mess with the burial ground. And I remember like it just really kind of struck my imagination as being something interesting. And then, I got caught up with the group. And then later at the end of our hike, it was dusk and dark, darkness is falling. And we walked past the same concentric circles. And for a moment, I noticed that one of the larger stones, it was almost a boulder, seemed to have moved. I thought it did. And I looked and it was still there. And I thought, wow, what if it had moved? What if there was something here that remained hidden, and that little idea and those stones slowly just sat in my brain rent free for years. And later on, I remember I wrote a couple of scenes for a screenplay based on that and it's actually, it came to fruition in Manitou in Cleo's what happens to Cleo and all his men.
Okay.
And
Insider information.
Insider information. I don't want to go into too much detail, but what ultimately happens to Cleo and his men. That scene actually was part of a screenplay that I started years ago, and I never really
wasn't the right format.
It didn't feel like the right format. But that idea of Cleo and his men and what they encounter came to mind, and I thought that might be something. And so it grew and it transformed and evolved and eventually that same scene found itself in Manitou, years and years later.
So this sparks two questions for me that are not on my list. You're making me go off my list.
Good.
But so two things here. So, I mean, I know the answer to one of these for sure, but something you just touched on, I think, is a theme within the book that you haven't really clued them into yet. And that's the fact that the Native American side of your story, you really haven't gone into that at all.
No.
But from what you were just saying, like, it seems like that plays relatively heavy role.
It's a background thread. It's tied to the supernatural elements in the story and the lore of them. And when you read it, you'll see the connection. But I basically, when I was doing some research, and for full transparency, my mother, Meg Ashley, who was a published author and stuff, she got a master's in Lakota lore and languages, and so growing up, I was surrounded by books on Native American mythology. And then, her husband also, his father was a fairly well-known paleontologist. Story for another day. But my step grandpa, I guess is what you would call him. His name was Jim Jensen, and he was known in that world, archaeologist, paleontologist. But he had uncovered some artifacts, Native American artifacts, in some of his digs, and some of those artifacts stayed in our home. One I can think of, I can't even think of the name of the tribe. They lived in the cliffs. Anasazi.
You're asking the wrong.
I think it's Anasazi, but there was a bowl in my mother's office. She had like a medicine wheel, and she had a bunch of like actual like real deal, not
Yeah, not the fake stuff.
not the
right?
pawn shop tourist stuff like that. It was made with real things, items, and but there was an Anasazi, I think it was Anasazi bull that dated like almost 2,000 years old or something. It was crazy ancient, and it was like a museum piece, and it was on the shelf in the office. So kind of
So
interesting.
suffice to say, it was in your background a lot. To
It
have
was, yeah. And, over when I was in college, I'd read different books, on Native American lore. I've always thought it's really interesting. But Manitou touches on some Nez Perce legends a little bit. And the supernatural element, I'm sort of dancing around it because I think it becomes very obvious what it is fairly early in the story. I don't want to come out and say it because I want to kind of,
takes away the mystery.
it takes a little of the mystery. I mean, it's that element of it is cleared out, but there's a layer to it that I don't think has been explored. It's an old legend, and there's a layer to it in this story that I think is a little different than what you would normally find in other books. It's a little bit, I hope,
Deeper, maybe.
deeper, maybe, hopefully.
I think so. Okay, so the other question takes me kind of down a different path, and maybe it'll get me back on track with some of my planned questions. But,
Yes.
whatever. So you mentioned that particular scene was originally imagined by you in a screenplay environment,
Right.
which I know that your screenplay background, screenwriter background, has always influenced the way you approach a story, a novel, a short story, whatever it is. That you see things really visually. But the fact that you actually wrote this particular scene to be done visually first, how big of an impact do you think that has on the way you design? Because, I mean, I think it's fair to say it's kind of obvious this is going to be somewhat of an action scene that you're talking about, the way you've described it already. So, like, how do you feel like that impacted the way you envisioned and wrote that scene in particular, but the whole book?
I think screenwriting's really helped me with pacing, and I think that that's something that. So it's a fine line. Like with screenwriting, when you write a scene, you're not using a lot of description because obviously the AD and the director are going to be making some choices to how a scene looks and plays out. And so what you're really doing is and I've explained this, I work with high school students in screenwriting as well, but something I explained to them is that you want to use an economy of words to describe a setting and to describe characters and with dialogue. And you want it to be as visual as possible, but as short and punchy as possible a lot of times. And for me, screenwriting has helped me immensely with pacing because there's a rhythm to scenes, even if you're reading in a novel. And, I've told you a lot of times that like, oh, I really enjoy this book. I really enjoy that book. But then there's moments and there's chapters that just seem to drag on and on.
Wheel of Time series, in my opinion.
Yeah. And it's like, and it's, I think my biggest challenge as someone who initially started writing on screenplays, and I've had some success there, but then moving to novel writing is that I've had to improve on my descriptions and on the layering, but it's also helped me with the pacing. Like
because the descriptions weren't really your responsibility before. It's like you would describe it to a point, but you knew ultimately someone else would make the decision.
Would take that imaging, and with novel writing, you really are the only painter on the canvas. So you really do have to go into, sensory descriptions, and you really do need to go into, layering your characters and how they interact and how they react and motifs that play out in the background that somehow connect to the theme and all these other balls that come into play. So, I feel like as a writer, I'm improving with that. There's certainly, elements that I really enjoy in Soothsayer. And then there's things where I'm like, oh gosh, I could have done that better, or I could have spent more time with this character. And, I think I will once I write the sequel. But, like, I think that's the balance for me is that how do I keep the pacing tight and still deliver a layered story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go back a little bit to what I planned on
Yeah.
asking you a little bit more. So you've mentioned Soothsayer a couple times now. Anyone who's actually read it already knows that there was a fair amount of your faith brought into that story. Is that, I mean, for people who haven't, or don't, obviously nobody's read Manitou yet, it's not out yet,
Not out.
except for me and a few select people. Does that play a role in this book? Because it sounds like, I mean, obviously this is a lot darker. It's not as allegorical as something like Soothsayer is. So does it still play a role? And if so, how?
Yeah, it does. It does. The themes are there. I think as a person of faith, you can approach Manitou, and as you read what the protagonists and the other characters, how they deal with a lot of the problems that come around, ultimately you'll see that some of them reach towards their faith, and that's ultimately what saves them, is dependence on God and God's provision. And I think I try to make that pretty clear in Manitou, but I also don't shy away from the dark side. And, this is a violent, supernatural crime thriller. I mean, that's the best way I can poke it, is a supernatural crime thriller. And it's not for kids. Soothsayer was very much a young adult. This is very much adult. And there is violence, and there is a little bit of profanity, and I've tried not to be excessive with either, but at the same time, I want people who are not necessarily coming from a point of faith to read it and to enjoy the story on that level. And then people who do have a faith background can read it and maybe see an extra layer there, that's not, in your face, but absolutely present.
So was there a moment, I'm jumping ahead a little bit because you're doing something that I have a tendency to do. You're answering questions I haven't asked yet, but I planned on asking, so that's great. But is there or was there a moment when you were writing Manitou that you felt it challenged you personally, either on a creative level or on a spiritual level, especially, with what you're talking about, trying to balance the darkness? I mean, we obviously need to see truly the darkness in order for the light to be illuminated. But was there something that you felt personally challenged when you were writing?
Creatively, well, and I guess spiritually, there's one character in the book who's basically a serial killer, and getting into that character's head took some doing, and really
great before, by the way, that wasn't just easy for you to slip into that.
Yes,
because that's not who you are.
I just stood over you while you napped with like a butcher knife.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I think that was a little challenging, is trying to understand that kind of a person and what motivates them to kill, and just be as brutal as possible. And so sometimes getting into characters' heads can be a little tough,
when they're so opposite of you.
yeah. I think, yeah, for sure. Creatively, I think it was also, with this book, I really wanted to make sure that the characters felt fully formed. Even though there are a lot of characters in this book, I tried to make sure that none of them were one-dimensional. And so really sitting with each character, even the really minor ones, and kind of saying like, okay, where does this person, where do they come from? What are they struggling with? Stuff that you may not even see, but I, as an author, like I need to know that. Right. And it's, so I think as an author, I grew a little bit in that I really tried to do that for every single character. So that creatively was a bit of a challenge, from someone that like doesn't typically spend a ton of time on side characters, and this one I was like, okay, I'm gonna try to go a little deeper with that.
So what kind of reader? I mean, you've talked about how this is so different. We've talked about how it's so different from what you've written in the past, but also that there is a somewhat of a similarity to who might be interested in this. But what kind of reader do you think is going to connect most deeply with this story in particular?
I think obviously anyone that enjoys books from like Peter Benchley or Michael Crichton or Stephen King, from a secular standpoint, or Dean Koontz, if you enjoy those authors, then you'll probably enjoy this. Outside of the secular, for my Christian audience, I would say you know this story, and I guess I'll just sort of jump into like some of the themes
Yeah,
present.
that's a future question, so go ahead.
Or I could
No,
wait.
it's okay.
I don't know,
Yeah.
but it's kind of hard to talk about this and not talk about that.
Yeah, for sure.
I think Manitou is very much about loss and about what we do with that when it falls on us, with despair and loss. Whether it's loss of family or a dream, or loss of identity or career, on all the different ways that happens. And really, in Manitou, every character has some form of loss they're dealing with, and how they deal with that, is sort of tied to our faith, and some of the characters fall into, in fact, most of the characters fall into one form of addiction or another, and whether it's gambling or sex or violence or, money or, alcohol, drugs are in there. Yeah. But the idea that, as Christians, really, when loss inevitably hits us, we have to turn to God. And I feel like that's something that the characters, two of the main characters, really wind up doing near the end, is they kind of realize they are not strong enough to deal with the loss and the pain and the darkness on their own. And it's kind of like in my own life, and this, but our audience might not. This last year, 2025 was a rough year for me personally. I had a lot of people in my family that I lost, and had a lot of also changing circumstances in my family, and and job uncertainty, and all sorts of things happened in the last year. And it felt like kind of that dark doorway of the soul, the thing that, like, everyone has to go through in life, and it's scary. And ultimately, when you do pass through it, it's really reliance on our Father to get us through. And even if we don't understand why we're stepping through that door, and that imagery is, obviously it's present in what Roy goes through and stuff, the protagonist. So I think, people of faith, if you're having kind of one of those dark nights of the soul times in your life, I think you might actually really enjoy where this story goes, even though it's very unconventional and it is maybe not even in a genre that you would normally read. I would encourage you to pick it up, because I think you might actually glean something from it.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because like my folks are people who read pretty much everything that you write, because they're being supportive, and
Right.
and they like it, but they're being supportive. And I remember
Ray and Lori, thank you.
I remember when you were first giving Manitou to them. I remember very specifically being like, make sure my mom knows that, like, this is not her because
So a heads up, my mother-in-law reads devotionals and only watches Hallmark
not
movies.
only, but she likes Hallmark movies.
That's all she
This
watches.
kind of dark
It's not
story
her
is not her
thing
thing.
at
She's not
all.
really into the, like, this kind of supernatural stuff. She's not, it's
Right.
just not her thing. But she loved this book, and I think, just as an aside to what you already said,
Mm.
I think a lot of that might come from the fact that you did spend the time developing those characters, especially the primary ones, because she has a background in psychology and all of that, and so I think she was able to really see the depth that you put into Roy and some of the other characters, and follow kind of that train of it, and let the setting and the genre of it all just kind of go by. You know what I mean? Just like, oh, okay, that happened, but I'm more interested in this, you know? So I think it shows that there is a depth to the characters because this kind of book, I mean, you mentioned Jaws as an example.
Right.
So like the typical kind of monster story, you know, that goes along with Jaws and things like that, they're not super deep most of the time. I mean, they have a tendency to be very focused on,
Yeah.
you know, the surface, but the monster of it all, right? Like they don't necessarily go so deep into characters. Jaws maybe is an anomaly there because he did go further into the characters.
It really does. I mean, it's,
Yeah.
and I know it, yeah, absolutely. That most monster movies are about the monster, but I think most well-written monster movies and monster stories reveal more about the people that are affected by the monster.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I think Jaws kind of is archetypal almost because, you know, you watch the movie, you know, in the first half of the movie, it's just basically the shark eating people. But what you get in the second half is kind of like a master class in characterization. And, you know, between Chief Brody and Matt Hooper and Quint, you know, these three guys who come from such different backgrounds and really have nothing in common and kind of really butt heads throughout the entire second half of the film, and then kind of form this bond in this central purpose to kill the shark. And
Like a trauma bond almost.
yeah, and it was something that I've always thought that Jaws did. The reason Jaws won as many awards and got and has been kind of stood the test of time was not because of the monster. It was because of the characters that Spielberg and Peter Benchley, the author of the book, developed together on the screen. You know, and it's
And the actors.
oh yeah, I mean absolutely. You know, you know, obviously the actors were a huge part of that, and but like if you read the novel Jaws, it was so there was so much more to it, obviously, than what was on screen. But you kind of see the corruption of the town and stuff, and you get a lot more backstory into what pushes these guys to the extremes that they are pushed to. You know, what motivates them to you know basically throw their lives at this monster. And you know, I think when I was really working on Manitou, I reread Jaws because I wanted to see how Benchley tackled that, you know, and how he used those characters. I mean, everybody loves the shark, but it was really the characters that I was looking at. And the same too, you know, I looked a lot at some Dean Koontz stuff too. I just really enjoy how he writes as well. So yeah.
So, okay, this is the last question I have prepared, and then if
All right.
we go off, then we go off. But
Sure.
when someone finishes the book,
Yeah.
what aspect of this story are you hoping that they're still thinking about? That you like, what are you hoping to leave them with after they're done reading?
I mean, obviously, you know, the supernatural element, I keep saying that, in this is based on well-known legends, especially in our area. And, you know, if it encourages you to like investigate for yourself and, you know, awesome, fun. It's a fun legend to look into. I think from a character standpoint, though, you know, like I said before, um, where we wind up with the characters, the major characters in it, you know, Roy and a couple other characters, is like, you know, how do we deal with, you know, the loss and how do we deal with when our life is uprooted, you know, how do you move forward from that? And you know, I hope that it makes them kind of start thinking about what they're relying on in their lives. Because like I said, you know, loss and tragedy and despair, you know, it happens to everybody at some point. It's a monster that you cannot escape in life. And what do you anchor yourself to when that wave hits? I think that's an important question that I hope every reader at least reflects on.
You mentioned a couple minutes ago just all the stuff that was going on last year and
Mhm.
all the things you were going through. And, you know, the fact that you'd already written
Yeah.
all, if not most, of this book at the time. Do you feel like having tackled those kinds of themes and already given a lot of reflection to that helped you through?
Yeah. 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 I mean, I had already rewritten Manitou twice or three times. You know, I'd done the original, and I had gotten some very early feedback from some friends. And then I sort of went back, and I knew that it needed more, especially from the characters. It just wasn't. It was still a little one dimensional in some ways. And so when I was going through losses in the family and stuff, it helped me to kind of put myself into the character's shoes a little bit more, and think about authenticity and motivation and stuff, and really try to make them, like I said, more fleshed out. So
But I'm also talking about the reverse of it. Do you feel like the fact that you had just gone through a story that brought you the realization that going through loss, the best path forward is to rely on God and not just on yourself? Do you feel like that kind of prepared you maybe a little bit more to go through what you were going to go through?
I think so. I mean, I wasn't aware of it,
Yeah, maybe not consciously.
like a lot of times when I'm writing a story, I don't always, the themes aren't always apparent until I start the revision process. I'm like, oh, I didn't even mean to like bring that in, but I guess it's there, and um because writing Manitou and then what was happening personally in my life was kind of concurrent, and rewriting it, I think it sort of got woven in there a lot more than originally it was. And I think it added some depth to it. So it was something that, I bring up a lot of questions that Roy asks, the universe as dealing with these problems that I think that you and I have gone through and asked ourselves. So I don't know if it helped me come to any major conclusions in that moment. I think looking back now, I can say absolutely, I know where I stand in my faith, but I think it helped me kind of process for sure. Absolutely. Yeah. So,
All right, so now we do the obligatory, this is a
mm,
YouTube video. So
right.
now you've heard all this stuff about the book, you've gotten to know
Oh,
more
should we do a
about
thing
you.
about the cover? Like make the little cover on
Oh,
screen?
well, yeah, but we'll get to that.
Okay.
What I was going to say is, now that you've gotten them interested,
Right.
when are they going to be able to get this book? Where are they going to be able to get this book?
Mhm.
All of those things.
Okay, so it is going through, it's already been edited. It's gone through, all the different edits, my editors, and it is now going through layout, which is its own process in order to be publishable in paperback and an ebook. There'll be the two forms that'll be initially available in. Um, it is the verge of March 2026 right now. So I believe and I'm praying that by April, I'll be able to release it, and it'll be absolutely available on Amazon. So that'll be the first place it'll be available right off the bat is Amazon. I'm also doing some author events this year. I'll be again at the Treasure Valley Book Fair in Nampa,
In Idaho.
in
We're
Idaho.
watching from elsewhere.
Yeah. So I'll be there, and hopefully if my publishing partners can hurry up, I can have copies for the book fair. There'll also be a lot of other great local authors there. So if you're local in Idaho in the Treasure Valley, come say hi. Obviously, like I have mostly fantasy and thrillers and that kind of thing, but I'll also be offering up my mom's books, including the Boarding House series, which was a middle grade young adult Christian mystery series that was originally published through Tyndale House. And
Who's the audience for this?
I want to say like fifth to eighth graders. I believe that's kind of it's kids, yeah, touching on young adults.
It's kind of from what I remember, similar to like the Boxcar Children. So like if that's
Similar, yeah.
that's a series that you even recognize or sounds familiar. It's got a similar vibe.
Right. So we'll be, I'll be offering those for sale as well. And also my mother's last novel, Through the Corner of Circles, which is kind of a magical realism, Native American fantasy epic. It's,
So
I,
many
it's a lot. I would say that the elevator pitch on that one is Dances with Wolves meets Lord of the Rings. I mean, it's kind of the two, and it's a great novel. I hold that she is probably a better writer than I am, but it's a fantastic novel, and that'll also be available at the book fair.
and on Amazon.
Yeah, all these books are also available on Amazon. Her name was Meg Ashley.
So we'll link all this stuff in the
Yeah,
description.
absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, and of course I'll have the soothsayer available too. So yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Anything else? Anything I didn't ask that you wish I had asked, or something that you didn't get to say?
So as far as the channel goes, stay tuned because I will be, I know I haven't been as consistent in the past as I've been finishing up this book, but I plan to be more consistent now with storytelling, whether that be in books that I read or films or TV shows or whatever form that takes place in. So,
Awesome. So then they should probably subscribe. to the channel so they
yes.
don't miss that stuff.
So
Say
please.
YouTuber right here. He's
Right,
not
right.
good at this.
Yeah. So
Make sure you
please like.
subscribe, like the video, comment, all those things to let him know that this is worth doing, that you actually are interested in
Yeah.
hearing what he has to say, like I know you are.
Absolutely. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.